Good evening. The syringe was small, glass in those days, heavy and cold in the palm, the way glass always is when it carries something serious. The nurse drew the clear liquid up slowly, checked the barrel against the light, and pressed the plunger just slightly to clear the air. Then she turned toward the bed. The woman lying there had not slept properly in 3 days. She had come through major abdominal surgery the previous morning, and the pain was of the particular kind that surgery produces. Not the sharp, immediate pain of injury, but something deeper and more relentless, a pain that lived in the body the way weather lives in old bones, constant and surrounding, and impossible to escape. She had tried to speak to the morning nurse. The effort of speaking had made everything worse. The injection entered the IV line quietly. There was no ceremony to it, no announcement of what was coming. Within 4 minutes, the pain was gone. At almost that exact moment, across the city, another syringe carrying the very same drug was entering another arm. One person was lying in a hospital bed. The other man was standing in an alley, not dulled, not softened around the edges. Gone for both of them, replaced by something that people who experience it reach for the same word to describe, regardless of which room they were in when it arrived. Warmth, warmth that came from the inside. She closed her eyes. She slept. He closed his eyes. He breathed. He had not come by it through a hospital. He had not come by it through a doctor. He had paid for it, and what he had paid was considerable, because the thing he was holding was not easy to find on the streets, and everyone who knew what it was understood that it was worth what it cost. He had another name for it. Not Dilaudid, not Hydromorphone, not any of the careful clinical language that lived on the label. He called it hospital heroin, the same molecule, 2 rooms, 2 needles, 2 entirely different worlds, and yet, between them, no difference at all that the chemistry could detect. How does something like that happen? The answer is not simple. It never is when the question involves a molecule that has been, simultaneously, one of the most trusted tools in modern medicine and one of the most sought-after substances in the criminal underworld. It is not a story of good versus evil, or science versus recklessness, or medicine versus addiction. It is stranger than any of those framings. It is a story about what happens when you take a structure that the human brain was not designed to withstand. Name it something clinical, lock it behind steel cabinet doors, and convince yourself the locks will always hold. Tonight, we are following the complete history of Dilaudid, from its birth in a German chemical laboratory in 1921, through the operating theaters and cancer wards that made it indispensable, to the decade when the streets gave it a second name that no pharmaceutical company had ever intended. Before we go further, if these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history help you rest, a like and a subscribe means a great deal. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are tonight and what time it is there. It always moves me, the thought of so many people in so many different places settling in for the night with the same story. Now then, dim the lights a little more, set your phone face down, and let us begin where all chemical stories begin. Not in a hospital and not in an alley, but inside a molecule. There is a city on the Rhine in southwestern Germany called Ludwigshafen. It sits on the flat western bank of the river, directly across from Mannheim, and in the early decades of the 20th century, it smelled of industry, coal smoke and chemical solvents, and the particular sharp tang that rises from large quantities of organic compounds being heated in enclosed spaces. It was not a beautiful city. It was a working city, the kind that produces things rather than contemplating them. And among the things it produced in the years after the First World War were pharmaceutical compounds of extraordinary complexity and consequence. The firm of A.G. Knoll had been established in Ludwigshafen in 1886 by Albert Knoll and his son Hans. It was not a large company, not by the standards of the German chemical giants that surrounded it. The enormous edifices of BASF and Bayer that had already begun reshaping what human beings understood to be possible in the realm of chemical science. Knoll was smaller, more focused, more specialized. It worked primarily in the chemistry of morphine derivatives, compounds related to the alkaloid that had been extracted from the opium poppy since the early 19th century and had, in that time, transformed medicine and then very nearly destroyed a significant portion of the people medicine was supposed to help. This was the problem that Knoll's chemists were working to solve. It was not a new problem. It was, in fact, the defining problem of opioid pharmacology, the question that had haunted the field since morphine was first isolated in 1804, and physicians began celebrating what they were certain was a gift without a cost. Morphine relieved pain with an efficiency that nothing before it had matched. It quieted the body's most desperate signals. It allowed surgery to be survived, and wounds to be endured, and terminal illness to be approached with something other than naked animal terror. It was, by any reasonable medical accounting, a miracle. And then the patients who had been given it began returning, not for the surgery they had recovered from, not for the wounds that had healed. They returned because they could not stop, because something had happened inside them during the weeks or months of treatment that did not simply cease when the treatment ceased, because their bodies had learned a new requirement, a requirement the body had not had before the first dose was administered. And that requirement now organized itself around the absence of the drug with a ferocity that made the original pain seem manageable by comparison. The medical community of the 19th and early 20th centuries was not ignorant of this phenomenon. They simply did not have an adequate framework for understanding it, and so they described it in moral rather than biological terms. Patients who could not stop using morphine were described as lacking willpower, as being constitutionally weak, as possessing some pre-existing defect of character that the drug had merely revealed. The drug itself was not the problem. The drug was the miracle. The problem was the people who could not be trusted with it. This framing, the idea that the molecule was innocent and the user was culpable, would prove enormously durable. It would last far longer than the evidence warranted, and it would shape, in ways that became catastrophic, how the next generation of chemists approached the task of building something better. The task, as it was understood in Ludwigshafen in the years after the First World War, was to build an opioid that worked the way morphine worked. That is to say, that it would silence severe pain with speed and reliability. But that would not produce the dependency that morphine produced. The assumption embedded in this task, the assumption that nobody examined carefully because it was too useful to examine, was that dependency was a property that could be engineered away. That if you changed the molecule in the right places, you could keep the analgesia and discard the addiction. That these were two separable features of the same compound, like removing the seeds from a fruit while keeping the flesh. In 1921, a chemist working within the Knoll research program made a small alteration to the morphine molecule. Small is the correct word. The change was almost undetectable when written out in chemical notation. A modification at position 6 of the benzyl ring, where a hydroxyl group was replaced with a keto group, a ketone function. The full name of the resulting compound was 4,5-alpha-epoxy 3-hydroxy 17-methylmorphonin 6,1. It was a hydrogenated ketone of morphine, a close structural relative, a first cousin, if you allow the familial metaphor, of the very substance the chemists were trying to improve upon. The compound was tested. The results were striking. The new molecule was considerably more potent than morphine, not twice as potent or 3 times. Figures that would have been impressive but perhaps not transformative. The early assessments placed it at somewhere between 5 and 10 times the analgesic power of morphine by weight, with subsequent clinical data settling on an intravenous equivalence of roughly 2 milligrams of the new compound, producing the same pain relief as 10 milligrams of morphine. In practical terms, this meant that doses could be dramatically smaller, which was understood to be medically advantageous. Smaller doses were easier to control, easier to measure, easier to administer with precision. It was also faster. The structural change had altered how the molecule crossed the blood-brain barrier. The protective chemical wall the body erects between the bloodstream and the brain. The new compound crossed it more readily, more rapidly, arriving at the brain's opioid receptors with a speed that morphine could not match. The onset of action was quicker. The peak effect arrived sooner. The relief began in minutes, rather than the longer lag that morphine sometimes required. The duration was shorter as well, a detail that was noted in the clinical assessments and filed under the heading of advantages, because a drug that wore off sooner gave physicians more control over the treatment. They could calibrate more precisely. They could adjust more responsively. The shortness of action was understood as a feature of reliability. Nobody in the Knoll laboratory in 1921 understood what the shortness of action would eventually mean in the context of addiction. That understanding was still decades away. The patent was filed in 1923. And here, in the naming of the thing, there is a detail that deserves a moment of attention, because names carry meaning, and sometimes they carry more meaning than the people who choose them intend. The compound was given the brand name Dilaudid. The etymology is straightforward enough. D prefix from the chemical process of hydrogenation, lauded from laudanum, laudanum. The 19th century's preferred preparation of opium dissolved in alcohol. The thick reddish-brown liquid that had been sold across Europe and North America for 2 centuries as a cure for pain and anxiety and insomnia and a dozen other complaints that had created a generation of dependent users whose dependency was treated, in the moral language of the era, as personal weakness rather than pharmacological consequence, that had been dispensed to children as a calming agent and to women as a treatment for the loosely defined ailment of nervous distress, that had left its mark on the literature of the Romantic period and the death registers of the Victorian era in roughly equal measure. The chemists at Knoll named the new, improved, stronger, faster, supposedly safer opioid after the substance they were meant to be replacing. The ghost was in the name from the beginning. In 1926, Dilaudid was introduced to the American market. Knoll brought it to pharmacies and hospitals in the form of oral tablets, small, white, in several strengths. and as injectable ampules of solution for intravenous administration. The medical community received it with the cautious but genuine optimism that greeted pharmaceutical advances in that era, before the accumulated weight of subsequent century had made the word revolutionary, when applied to a drug, into something closer to a warning than a commendation. Within 7 years, more than 200 publications had appeared in the medical literature describing the compound's pain-relieving properties. A landmark review was published in 1933 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. A detailed assessment of the drug's clinical performance that confirmed what the early testing had suggested. It was effective, it was reliable, and its potency made it particularly valuable in situations where ordinary doses of morphine were insufficient. The review also noted, in the measured language of scientific literature, that the drug produced dependency in patients who used it over extended periods. This was not considered grounds for alarm. Morphine produced dependency as well, and morphine remained the foundation of hospital pain management. The presence of dependency was understood as an unfortunate but manageable property of opioids generally, not as a specific danger unique to this new compound, and not as evidence that the fundamental premise of the project, that dependency could be engineered away, had been wrong from the start. It had been wrong from the start. The flaw was not in the chemistry. The chemistry was remarkable. The flaw was in the assumption that addiction was a moral property, a character weakness, a problem that resided in certain kinds of patients rather than in the pharmacological mechanism itself. That assumption meant that the evidence arriving from clinical practice was consistently misread. When patients became dependent, the dependency was attributed to the patients, the molecule remained innocent, and the search for a better opioid, a stronger one, a cleaner one, a safer one, continued on the basis of a premise that experience was quietly and repeatedly disproving. This is the pattern that you will recognize if you spend time in the history of opioid pharmacology. It repeats across more than a century, with an almost formal regularity, like a piece of music played in the same key but with different instruments in each generation. Morphine was meant to be safer than opium. Heroin, synthesized in 1898 and briefly marketed by Bayer with genuine commercial enthusiasm, was meant to be safer than morphine. Dilaudid was meant to be safer than morphine. And across each of these transitions, the same error was made in the same way by intelligent and educated people who are operating in good faith within a flawed framework. The framework was, the drug is the tool, and the person using it is the variable. The truth was, both are variables. And the drug, when it reaches a brain that was never designed to experience the level of chemical stimulation these compounds produce, reliably does to that brain something that has very little to do with the moral character of the person in whose skull that brain resides. In 1926, in the city of Ludwigshafen, that truth was still somewhere in the future. For now, there was only a clear liquid in a glass ampule, a new name embossed on a label, and the quiet, confident certainty of scientists who believed they had built something better. They had built something extraordinary. That much was true. Whether it was better depended entirely on what you meant by the word. And that question, the question of what better means when you are talking about a molecule that can remove pain from the human experience with a speed and completeness that nothing in nature achieves, is the question that the next 100 years of Dilaudid's history would attempt and fail and attempt again to answer. In our next section, we go somewhere the chemists of 1921 had never been able to go. We go inside the brain that the molecule was about to meet, inside the system of receptors and pathways and chemical signals that hydromorphone was about to lock into with a force and a precision that the human body had never been designed to withstand. Rest a little, if you like. We have time tonight. The story's long, and the most important part of it, the part that explains everything that came after, everything that happened in the hospitals and in the alleys and in the emergency rooms, begins not in a laboratory in Germany, but in the small, extraordinary architecture of the brain. Close your eyes for a moment if you like. Not literally. Stay with me. But imagine, just for a moment, that you are lying in a hospital bed. It does not matter what brought you there, surgery perhaps, or an injury of the kind that does not announce itself slowly, but arrives all at once, without warning, in a single, terrible instant. The details are not important. What is important is the pain. And the pain, in this imagining, is absolute. It is not the manageable ache of a headache or the sullen throb of a strained muscle. It is the kind of pain that occupies you entirely, that fills the available space of your consciousness the way water fills a room, that makes it impossible to think about anything else because thinking itself requires a quiet corner of the mind, and pain of this magnitude does not leave quiet corners. The nurse arrives. The IV line is in your arm. She attaches a small syringe to the line. 2 milligrams of hydromorphone hydrochloride in a clear solution drawn into the barrel and pressed forward until the air is cleared. And she pushes the plunger with a slow, steady pressure. You feel a coldness move up your arm. It is not unpleasant. It is simply the temperature of the solution entering the bloodstream, cooler than blood, traveling towards the heart. Then, before you have properly registered that anything has happened, something else begins. It is not warmth exactly, though warmth is the word most people reach for. It is more precise than warmth. It is an absence that arrives so quickly and so completely that it feels like presence. The pain, which had been total, stops being total. Then it stops being significant. Then it simply stops. And in the space where the pain was, there is nothing identifiable by any ordinary emotional vocabulary. Not happiness, not relief, not the particular brightness of sudden good news. It is something further back than those things. Something more fundamental. The sensation, as one patient described it, of being set down gently after carrying something very heavy for a very long time. You close your eyes, you sleep. This is not magic. It is not mysterious, despite how mysterious it feels to experience it. What has just occurred inside your body is a sequence of chemical events so precisely described by pharmacology that it can be drawn on a diagram, traced along specific pathways, mapped to specific structures in the brain with millimeter-level accuracy. The miracle has a mechanism, and understanding the mechanism is the only way to understand everything that follows. Every theft, every overdose, every patient who returned to the hospital, not for the surgery they had recovered from, but for the drug they had been given to help them recover. The story begins with a receptor, deep inside the brain, not at its surface, not in the structures associated with conscious thought or language or memory, but in older, more primitive regions that the brain shares with species that have been on this planet far longer than human beings. There is a class of molecular structure called the Mu-Opioid receptor. The name comes from the Greek letter mu, which was assigned to this particular receptor type, when pharmacologists first began mapping the opioid system in the 1970s. The receptor itself is a protein embedded in the surface of certain nerve cells, and it functions, in the simplest possible terms, as a lock. The brain built these locks for itself. This is the part of the story that tends to surprise people, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it changes the entire frame of what follows. The Mu-Opioid receptor does not exist in the human brain because the human brain anticipated drugs. It exists because the human brain produces its own opioid-like chemicals, compounds called endorphins and enkephalins and dynorphins, that bind to these receptors under specific circumstances: intense physical exertion, severe pain, profound emotional states, moments of connection, the runner's high, the strange calm that sometimes follows an injury before the pain arrives. The body has a system for managing its own extremes, and the Mu-Opioid receptor is the keyhole through which that system operates. Hydromorphone is not the key this lock was built for. It is, to extend the metaphor slightly beyond its comfortable limit, a crowbar that fits the keyhole. It binds to the Mu-Opioid receptor with an affinity and a force that the brain's own endorphins cannot match, and when it binds, it opens the lock, activates the receptor, with a completeness and a speed that the endogenous system was never designed to produce. What happens when the lock opens? The signal travels down through the nerve cell, along the network, toward a structure that sits deep in the core of the brain, the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. The VTA is a small cluster of neurons, small in the way that a match is small, and it has a function in the brain's architecture that is disproportionate to its size. It is one of the primary sources of dopamine in the human brain. Not dopamine in the loose colloquial sense in which the word gets used in popular conversation to mean something vaguely pleasant. Dopamine in its precise neurochemical role, a signaling molecule that the brain uses to encode the experience of reward, to tell itself that whatever just happened was important, to mark an event as something that should be sought again. When the Mu-Opioid receptors in the VTA are activated, a cascade begins. Inhibitory neurons that normally keep the dopamine-producing cells in check, neurons whose job is essentially to regulate the volume of the reward signal, are suppressed. The restraint is removed, and the dopamine-producing cells, freed from their ordinary constraints, fire. The signal floods forward through the mesolimbic pathway toward the nucleus accumbens, which sits further forward in the brain and serves as the primary locus of the reward response. The dopamine surge that results from this cascade is not small. Research into the neurobiology of addiction has estimated it at roughly 4 to 5 times greater than the dopamine response produced by natural rewards, food, sex, social connection, the experiences that the reward system was built to incentivize. 4 to 5 times. The brain's primary mechanism for encoding importance and driving behavior is firing at a magnitude it was never designed to sustain, triggered by a molecule it was never designed to encounter. And the message it is writing into the neural architecture of the person experiencing it is written in a font many times larger than anything that experience would ordinarily produce. The brain, in short, is being told that this is the most important thing that has ever happened to it. And here is the piece that the chemists of 1921 could not have known, because the neuroscience to understand it did not exist in 1921 and would not exist for another 50 years. The feature that was listed in the No Laboratories clinical assessments as an advantage, the speed. The faster onset, the quicker crossing of the blood-brain barrier, the more rapid arrival at peak effect. Speed, it turns out, is not a safety feature. Speed is the danger. The brain's reward system does not simply record that a reward occurred. It records how the reward arrived, the rate of change, the steepness of the rise. A rapid, steep rise in dopamine signaling is encoded as more important, more salient, more worth repeating than a slow, gradual one producing the same eventual peak. This is why intravenous drug use produces a more powerful reinforcement response than oral ingestion, even when the total drug delivered is identical. The route of administration determines the speed of arrival, and the speed of arrival determines how loudly the brain registers what has happened. Hydromorphone, injected intravenously, crosses the blood-brain barrier faster than morphine. It arrives at its receptor targets more rapidly. The dopamine signal rises more steeply, and the brain, faithful to its own arithmetic, records the event as correspondingly more significant, more worth remembering, more worth repeating, more worth organizing behavior around in the future. Clinical studies examining the subjective experience of hydromorphone compared to heroin in human subjects found something that pharmaceutical literature tends to present in careful, measured language, but which is not, in its essence, ambiguous. Intravenous hydromorphone produces subjective effects that are nearly indistinguishable from intravenous heroin. Both are rapid, potent Mu-Opioid receptor agonists. Both cross the blood-brain barrier quickly. Both produce the same quality of dopamine surge in the same brain structures via the same pathway. The brain, running its own chemistry, cannot tell them apart. Whatever the manufacturer's label says, whatever the legal and regulatory and moral distinctions between a Schedule II hospital medication and a Schedule I prohibited substance, the receptor does not read labels. This is what the streets understood long before the hospitals admitted it. And then there is the duration. The shorter duration that Knoll's assessments had filed under advantages. The property that gave physicians more control, that allowed more precise adjustment of treatment. That property, viewed through the lens of addiction neuroscience, is not an advantage at all. It is the other half of the same problem. The Mu-Opioid receptors, saturated by the drug and driven to their maximum activation, do not remain in that state indefinitely. The drug clears, the receptors deactivate, the dopamine signal falls, and the brain, which has just experienced a signal 4 to 5 times greater than any natural reward it has encountered, which has just written the experience into its reward architecture in letters larger than anything ordinary life produces, is now experiencing the absence of that signal. The contrast between the peak and the trough is not simply the absence of pleasure. It is something the brain actively interprets as deprivation, as wrongness, as a state that needs to be corrected, as the primary fact requiring attention in the current moment. Craving is not a weakness of character. It is a neurological event. It is the brain's reward system issuing a directive based on the information it has been given, the information written into it by the previous dose, the information that says, the most important thing is to restore what was lost. The shorter the duration of the drug, the sooner this state arrives. Hydromorphone's half-life is shorter than morphine's. The trough comes faster. The directive is issued sooner. The brain turns its attention toward the task of restoration more quickly than it would if a slower drug had been used. This is not, as the Knoll chemists believed, a feature of controllability. It is the mechanism of accelerated dependency, not less addictive than morphine, more addictive, faster. There is one further piece of the mechanism worth understanding before we leave the brain and return to the world, because it is the piece that explains why the story does not end with the first patient who discovers the dependency and stops using the drug. The Mu-Opioid receptors adapt. With repeated activation, they downregulate, reduce in number, and in sensitivity. As a system under sustained excessive stimulation, will always attempt to return to equilibrium. The receptors that have been hammered by the signal begin to protect themselves from the signal. The dose that produced the warmth and the relief and the complete cessation of pain in the first week of treatment produces less of those effects in the second week and considerably less in the month that follows, because the system receiving the signal is no longer the same system that received it the first time. It has changed. It has attempted to compensate. The clinical term for this is tolerance. The experiential term is simpler. The dose that worked stops working. The dose that worked yesterday is today merely the dose that prevents the symptoms of withdrawal, the dose below which the body will begin to actively protest. With sweating and nausea and a quality of muscular distress that former users describe, with a consistency that suggests its particularity is not exaggerated. So the dose that works must increase. And as the dose increases, the ceiling rises further. And the gap between where the patient began and where they now need to be, chemically speaking, is a gap that was created not by moral failing or constitutional weakness, but by the ordinary adaptive responses of a biological system to a chemical for which it was not designed. The chemists in Ludwigshafen in 1921 had created something that was 5 to 10 times more potent than morphine, that arrived at its targets faster than morphine, that wore off sooner than morphine, and that produced, in the brain structures responsible for encoding reward and driving behavior, a signal of an intensity that natural experience could not approach, and that the brain, once it had experienced it, would not easily relinquish. They believed they had built something better. In the narrow clinical sense, in the context of a patient in genuine, severe acute pain, receiving a carefully monitored dose under controlled conditions with no pre-existing opioid exposure, they were not wrong. Dilaudid was and remains a remarkable analgesic. The relief it provides to patients in the final stages of cancer, or recovering from major trauma, or enduring the particular agony of severe burns, and is real and significant and not replaceable by anything gentler. But the brain that receives it does not know it is in a hospital. It does not know the conditions are controlled, or the administration is monitored, or the intent is therapeutic. It knows only the signal. It knows the signal arrived and what magnitude it arrived at, and that the signal has since departed. And it begins, with the methodical insistence of a biological system following its own imperatives, to seek the return of what it has experienced. This is the pharmacology that the hospitals would use, and the streets would learn to exploit. These are the mechanics that turned a glass ampule in a nurse's locked cabinet into something that a man in an alley, in a city that we will come to shortly, was willing to pay more per milligram for than almost any other substance he could name. The molecule did not change between the cabinet and the alley. The receptor did not change. The cascade of events inside the brain did not change. The warmth did not change. And the afterwards did not change. And the brain's response to the afterwards did not change. Only the label was different. Before we continue into the operating theaters and locked cabinets and cancer wards where Dilaudid spent the first half of its life, before we follow the drug through the decades during which it built the medical reputation that would eventually make its street value so high, take a moment if you like. The room is quiet. The night is doing what nights do. We are only part way through this story, and the part that remains, the part that involves the question of how the hospital and the alley came to share a product without either of them intending it, is the part that takes the longest to understand, because it requires understanding not just the chemistry of a molecule, but the architecture of a system that was built to protect something it turned out not to understand completely. The drug worked. That was always true. That was never the question. The question, the one the brain's own architecture makes impossible to sidestep, is what it means to work perfectly on a system that was never designed to be worked on so perfectly. We will take that question with us now into the hospital. There is a particular smell to a hospital at night, not the antiseptic sharpness that people associate with medical environments. That belongs to the daytime, to the bright corridors and the busy hours. At night, the smell is different, quieter somehow, a combination of floor wax and laundered cotton, and something underneath both of those things that is harder to name. The particular atmospheric quality of a building that contains within its walls a very large number of people who are at their most vulnerable. People who have given over the management of their bodies to strangers. People who are sleeping in unfamiliar beds, attached to unfamiliar equipment, waiting for information about themselves that they do not yet possess. In an American hospital in the 1950s, the night shift moved on rubber-soled shoes through corridors lit by a softer, yellower light than the fluorescent brilliance of the day. The patients were grouped by condition and severity. The surgical recovery ward occupied its own wing, usually on an upper floor, and it was here that the most significant pain management took place. Here that the decisions about what to give and how much and when were made with the most careful attention, because the patients in surgical recovery were the ones whose bodies had been most recently and most dramatically interfered with, and whose need for adequate analgesia was not a matter of comfort, but of clinical outcome. Inadequately managed pain after major surgery was not merely unpleasant, it was dangerous. Patients who could not breathe deeply because breathing hurt could develop pneumonia. Patients who could not mobilize because moving was intolerable took longer to recover and developed complications. Patients who lay rigid and terrified in their beds, enduring what should have been a manageable post-operative course, left hospitals with slower healing times and longer admission lengths and more complex follow-up requirements. The management of pain was not ancillary to surgical care. It was surgical care. And in the middle of the 20th century, Dilaudid had become, for many anesthesiologists and surgical nursing teams, the most reliable tool they had for the management of severe acute pain. The reasons were those that the Knoll chemists had intended. The potency was predictable. 2 milligrams intravenously produced a reliably quantifiable level of analgesia, and that predictability allowed for precise dosing in a way that morphine, whose metabolism varied more significantly between patients, did not always allow. The onset was rapid. Pain relief in post-surgical patients began within minutes of administration, which mattered enormously in the immediate recovery period when uncontrolled pain was at its most acute. The duration was manageable, 4 to 6 hours of adequate analgesia, after which the next scheduled dose could be administered. maintaining a controlled cycle without the accumulation risks that came with longer-acting compounds. Burn units found it invaluable. The pain of severe burns is among the most extreme that the human body can experience, not merely from the original injury, which is devastating enough, but from the ongoing treatment, the wound debridement, and dressing changes that must be performed regularly, and that produce, each time, a fresh wave of agony in tissue that is already destroyed and already saturated with pain signals. For burn patients, Dilaudid provided a ceiling of relief that other available opioids could not consistently reach. Cancer wards found it indispensable. The pain of advanced malignancy, of tumors pressing against nerves, of bone metastases, of the slow systemic deterioration that accompanies certain kinds of cancer in their final stages, was the territory where Dilaudid had perhaps its most unambiguous moral claim. Here, in the rooms where patients were not recovering but dying, the question of dependency was largely moot. The concern was not what the drug might do to a patient over years of use. The concern was whether the hours and days remaining to that patient could be endured with anything approaching dignity and peace. For this purpose, Dilaudid was, and has remained, irreplaceable. No one who has watched a person in the terminal stages of bone cancer and understood what Dilaudid can do for that person's remaining hours has ever been ambivalent about its place in the pharmacopoeia. This is the drug as it was intended. This is the legitimate face of the molecule, and it is worth holding this face clearly in view for a moment, not as a counterweight to what comes later, not as an excuse or a mitigation, but simply because it is true, and because the truth of it is part of what makes the story complicated in the way that the most instructive stories always are. The drug was not a mistake. The relief it provided was real. The people who developed it, who refined it, who administered it with care and precision in surgical recovery wards and burn units and cancer rooms across the middle decades of the 20th century, they were not wrong to use it. They were doing what the drug was designed to do. The problem was not in the doing. The problem was in the not looking. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 classified hydromorphone as a Schedule II controlled substance, the most restrictive category available for drugs with accepted medical use. Schedule II meant that prescriptions could not be called in by phone. They had to be written by hand on a specific prescription form, in triplicate. One copy for the patient, one for the dispensing pharmacy, one for the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration's records. Every prescription traceable, every dispensation documented. The intent was to create a paper trail robust enough to deter diversion, robust enough that the movement of the drug from legitimate medical channels to illegitimate ones would produce a record that could be detected, investigated, prosecuted. Inside hospitals, the controls were more immediate. Dilaudid lived in the narcotics cabinet, a locked steel unit, typically mounted to a wall or set into a nurse's station, accessible only to authorized personnel and only by key, or in later decades, by electronic code. Every dose drawn from inventory was supposed to be signed out with the patient's name, the dose administered, the time, and the name of the administering nurse. Wasted portions, the fraction of a vial not used, were supposed to be witnessed and documented. The cabinet was supposed to be counted at every shift change, the inventory reconciled against the dispensation records, any discrepancy flagged and investigated. Supposed to be. The controls on paper were thorough. They described a system in which the movement of every milligram of Dilaudid through a hospital's inventory could be tracked with precision, a system in which theft would produce a gap in the record that would be detected within hours, a system in which the gap between the locked cabinet and the world outside it was, if not impossible, at least narrow enough to be monitored. What the controls described and what the controls produced were two different things. The gap between the description and the reality was not the result of negligence in any simple sense. It was the result of systems that had been designed by people who understood pharmacy and scheduling, but who had not fully accounted for the realities of a busy hospital ward under sustained pressure, the reality of nurses managing 8 or 10 post-surgical patients simultaneously at 3 in the morning, filling out narcotics logs by hand in the minutes between competing urgent demands, seeing the reality that witnessed waste required a second nurse to stop what she was doing and come to the cabinet. The reality that shift change reconciliation happened at the end of 12 hours of demanding work and was performed by people who were tired in the bone-deep way that hospital nurses are tired at the end of a long shift. In this environment, the logs were not always accurate. The waste documentation was not always complete. The shift change count was not always rigorous. Not because anyone intended harm, because the system had been designed for the institution as it was imagined rather than the institution as it existed. And into these small, unminded gaps, the first quiet anomalies began to appear. They were not dramatic. They did not announce themselves. They were the kind of thing that, in a busy ward, could be attributed to any number of ordinary explanations. A documentation error, a miscounting, a vial that had been recorded in the wrong column, a discrepancy of a milligram here, a log entry that did not quite reconcile with the previous shift's count there, small enough that the natural inclination for a charge nurse dealing with 3 other problems at the same moment was to attribute it to the ordinary friction of a complex system rather than to something more deliberate. Some of the anomalies were documentation errors, paperwork genuinely completed in haste and not reviewed with sufficient care. Some of them were not. Hospital staff addiction is a subject that the medical profession has, historically, been reluctant to examine with the frankness it deserves. The reluctance is understandable. Physicians and nurses occupy a position of social trust that makes the idea of impairment particularly alarming, and the professional culture of medicine, built on a premise of competence and control, of being the person in the room who manages crises rather than succumbing to them, made it extraordinarily difficult for practitioners who were struggling to identify their struggle as such, let alone to disclose it. The identity of the healer and the identity of the person who needs help do not sit easily in the same body. But nurses who worked in surgical recovery and oncology wards had, by the nature of their work, daily access to the most potent, legally manufactured opioids in existence. They were people subject to the same neurological vulnerability as any other person. The same Mu-Opioid receptors, the same mesolimbic reward pathway, the same capacity for the brain to register an extraordinary signal and begin organizing itself around the project of repeating it. And they worked in environments of sustained stress and physical and emotional demand, environments that the research literature on addiction consistently identifies as significant risk factors for substance use disorders. The nurse who began with a single dose used to manage the aftermath of a difficult shift. The pharmacist who discovered that the inventory reconciliation process had a gap through which a small and regular extraction would pass undetected. The physician with prescription authority who wrote a legitimate script for a patient who did not exist. These were not imaginary figures. They appeared in disciplinary records, in DEA investigations, in the accounts of hospital administrators who discovered, usually too late, that the narcotics cabinet had been functioning as a personal dispensary for someone on the authorized access list. The paper trail that was supposed to make diversion detectable was only as reliable as the people completing it, in the conditions in which it was being completed, under the institutional pressures that shaped what got recorded and what did not. And beyond the staff, there were the patients. A person prescribed Dilaudid for post-surgical pain, discharged home with a course of tablets, experiencing exactly what the neuroscience of Section 2 would predict. The warmth, the relief, the brain encoding the event as singularly significant, the dose wearing off sooner than expected, the next scheduled dose seeming very far away. This patient was not, in the initial prescription, any different from the grandmother in the hook of this story. The drug was appropriate. The need was real. The prescription was legitimate. But the legitimate prescription ended. The need the brain had developed did not end with it. Some of these patients returned to their physicians and were given more. Some sought second prescriptions from second physicians, a practice that the triplicate system was designed to prevent, but that, in the years before electronic records created cross-reference databases, required a degree of cross-checking between dispensing pharmacies that was inconsistent at best. Some discovered, through the informal networks that exist in every community, where people discuss what they need and what they have found, that the tablets they had been prescribed had a value outside the context of their own medicine cabinet, that someone, somewhere, would pay for them, that the price was higher than they would have guessed. And some of those patients made a calculation between their own decreasing need as recovery progressed and the economic value of the surplus they were holding, that led them to a decision whose consequences would ripple outward in ways they had not imagined and could not have fully traced. The streets hadn't named it yet. They had barely noticed it yet. But the drug was moving, quietly, in small quantities, through channels that the paper trail was not designed to detect, from surgical recovery wards and oncology units and home medicine cabinets, through the ordinary social networks of a city, into hands that had not been issued a prescription and would not be. By the late 1960s, by the early 1970s, those hands were beginning to understand what they were holding. There is a particular moment in the history of every drug that acquires a second life outside medicine. A moment that cannot be located on any calendar, that nobody recorded at the time because nobody present understood its significance. When someone without a clinical background first encounters the substance and understands, through direct experience rather than pharmacological education, exactly what it is capable of, what it feels like, what it produces in the brain of a person who has become tolerant to other opioids, and who is, therefore, approaching it with a nervous system already primed to receive it. That moment for Dilaudid happened somewhere in the American cities of the late 1960s and early 1970s. It happened in the way that such moments always happen. Not in a single location, not in a single community, but in several places at once, through the diffuse and uncoordinated mechanism of human beings sharing information about experiences that matter to them. And what was shared in those conversations, in those communities, among people for whom the experience of opioids was not theoretical, was something close to astonishment. This was not morphine. It was not the relatively slow, relatively rounded experience of the opioid that had dominated street-level use. It was faster. It was cleaner. It was more complete. It produced, in the brain that received it, a signal that made everything that had come before it seem like a faint sketch of the same subject. And it came from a hospital. It had a legitimate name, printed on a legitimate label, manufactured in a legitimate pharmaceutical facility to pharmaceutical standards of purity. It was not cut with anything. It was not variable in its content. It was exactly what the label said it was. The people who encountered it did not need a degree in neuropharmacology to understand what that meant. They understood it the way the brain always understands it, when something 4 to 5 times greater than its previous experience arrives at the reward system without warning. They gave it a name. Not the name on the label, not Hydromorphone, not Dilaudid, not any of the careful clinical language that belonged to the other world, the world of the locked cabinet and the triplicate prescription and the rubber-soled shoes at 3 in the morning. They called it hospital heroin. The name was not derogatory. It was descriptive, and it was accurate, and it spread through cities, through communities, through the informal information networks of people who needed to know what was available and what it cost and what it did, with a speed that no pharmaceutical marketing campaign could have matched, because it was being communicated by people who had direct experience of the product and who were sharing that experience with an enthusiasm born of the neurological reality that the drug produced. And somewhere in that spreading, in that naming, the two worlds that had seemed so completely separate, the world of the hospital and the world of the street, had already begun to occupy the same space, though neither side had yet looked up from its own concerns long enough to notice. The locked cabinet was still locked. The triplicate prescriptions were still being filed. The charge nurses were still conducting their shift change counts, making their entries, reconciling numbers that did not always reconcile. And in another part of the city, the same molecule was acquiring a reputation that Knoll Pharmaceuticals had never anticipated and would never endorse. 2 names, 1 substance. What happened next was simply the story of those 2 names living in the same world, and all the consequences that living in the same world, while pretending to inhabit different ones, eventually and inevitably produced. Consider the economics of it for a moment. A single vial of Dilaudid, 2 milligrams of hydromorphone hydrochloride in a clear aqueous solution, manufactured to pharmaceutical standards of purity in a licensed facility, packaged in sterile glass, labeled with its contents and its concentration and all the regulatory language that accompanied a Schedule II controlled substance, cost the hospital dispensing it a small number of dollars. The exact figure varied by decade and by purchasing arrangement, but the order of magnitude was consistent, a few dollars per vial at most. The manufacturing cost was lower still. Hydromorphone was not an exotic compound. The synthesis was well understood. The raw materials were not scarce. The economics of pharmaceutical manufacturing applied to a compound that had been in production since 1926 produced a unit cost that was modest by any standard. The same vial, in 2012, on a street in an American city, commanded approximately $3.29 per milligram. A standard 2 milligram vial was therefore worth, in street terms, roughly $6 to $7. An 8 milligram tablet, the highest oral dose, a small orange pill the size of a baby aspirin, was worth somewhere north of $25. a hospital dispensary stocking hundreds of such units in a month, in a city where the street was willing to pay those prices, represented, viewed from a certain angle, an enormous amount of unrealized value sitting behind a steel door with a combination lock. This is the arithmetic that the black market had performed with its characteristic efficiency sometime in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The market had identified a product, assessed its desirability among its customer base, established a price point that reflected that desirability, and begun the process of acquiring supply. It did not require a business school education to execute this analysis. It required only the basic intelligence of people operating in an environment where the identification of valuable and accessible commodities was a survival skill rather than an academic exercise. And the supply, it turned out, was not as inaccessible as the steel door suggested. The methods were not, in their broad outlines, novel. Pharmaceutical diversion had existed for as long as pharmaceuticals had existed. What was new in the 1970s and 1980s in the specific case of Dilaudid was the scale and the sophistication, the degree to which the drug's high street value had attracted organized and methodical attention from people whose capacity for organization and method was, in this particular domain, considerable. The first and most direct method was robbery. Pharmacy robbery in the United States is a phenomenon whose statistics reveal something about the economics of drug markets, with a precision that few other data sets can match. The Drug Enforcement Administration documented that pharmacy robberies in the United States increased by 82% between 2006 and 2011, a period during which the broader prescription opioid crisis was reaching its first major peak. Over that same 5-year window, more than 3,500 pharmacies were robbed. The drugs most frequently targeted, hydrocodone, oxycodone, and Dilaudid, were not chosen at random. They were chosen because the people choosing them understood exactly what they were worth and exactly who would buy them. A pharmacy robbery is not a subtle operation. It is direct, it is visible, and it carries significant criminal risk. The people who undertook it were weighing that risk against a calculation about the value of what they could acquire in a short period of time. In the case of Dilaudid, the calculation was not difficult. A pharmacist's narcotics inventory could represent in street market terms tens of thousands of dollars of value. The risk to reward arithmetic for someone already operating within a criminal economy and already accustomed to the management of risk was straightforward. But robbery was also loud. It attracted attention. It produced police reports and security footage and community awareness that made subsequent robberies in the same area more difficult. Robbery was, in the taxonomy of diversion methods, the blunt instrument, effective in the immediate term, but inherently limited by its own visibility. The more durable methods were quieter. Prescription fraud was, in the era before electronic records, surprisingly simple to execute and surprisingly difficult to detect. The architecture of the triplicate prescription system, designed, as we have seen, to create a paper trail, assumed that the paper trail was generated by legitimate actors. It assumed that the physician writing the prescription was a licensed physician writing for a real patient with a genuine clinical need. It assumed that the prescription form itself was what it appeared to be. None of these assumptions were reliably correct. Prescription pads were stolen from physicians' offices with a regularity that, in retrospect, seems almost remarkable. A blank prescription pad in the possession of someone who understood what to write on it was, in practical terms, a document that a busy pharmacist working through a stack of scripts at a counter had no reliable mechanism for distinguishing from a legitimate one. The physician's name was there. The DEA registration number was there. The drug and dose were written in the appropriate format. The signature at the bottom looked sufficiently like a signature. In a pre-digital world, verification was difficult and time-consuming, and in the ordinary rhythm of a pharmacy's working day, not consistently performed. Some fraudulent prescriptions were caught. The physician whose name appeared on them had reported their pad stolen, or the DEA number didn't match the prescribing physician's specialty, or a pharmacist who knew the physician personally recognized that the signature was not right. But many were not caught. Not in the immediate transaction and not in the aftermath, because the triplicate system's third copy went to the DEA, where it joined hundreds of thousands of other prescription copies in a filing system whose capacity for real-time cross-referencing was, in those years, essentially nil. Doctor shopping was the softer version of the same mechanism. A patient with legitimate access to the healthcare system, someone who could present themselves plausibly as a person in pain, which was not a difficult performance to give for someone who was, in fact, experiencing the genuine biological distress of opioid withdrawal, could visit multiple physicians in multiple practices, receive legitimate prescriptions from each, fill those prescriptions at different pharmacies in different parts of the city, and aggregate the resulting supply. The triplicate system's paper trail existed. It simply existed in 3 separate locations that had no reliable mechanism for comparing notes. This gap, the gap between the paper that was generated and the information that was actually synthesized from that paper, was not a failure of intent. It was a failure of infrastructure, of the moment in technological history when the regulatory framework was designed. The tools for the kind of real-time cross-referencing that would have closed this gap did not exist yet. And so the gap remained open, and through it, Dilaudid moved. But the method that was, in some ways, the most troubling to contemplate, because it was the most intimate, the most embedded in the very system that was supposed to prevent it, was the diversion that occurred not from outside the hospital, not through forged documents or broken pharmacy windows, but from inside, from people who had keys to the cabinet. The hospital staff member who diverted Dilaudid was not a figure of a single type. They were nurses and pharmacists, and physicians and pharmacy technicians spread across specialities and institutions and decades, connected by the common fact of their authorized access to a substance whose properties did not stop being what they were simply because the person administering them had a professional credential. The Mu-Opioid receptor, as we have established, does not read ID badges. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway does not ask about employment status. The warmth was the warmth, and the afterwards was the afterwards, and the brain's response to the afterwards was the brain's response, regardless of whether the person experiencing it had a nursing license. The methods available to someone in this position were various, and in the era before electronic dispensation systems, difficult to audit. A nurse could sign out a dose for a patient and administer less than the documented amount, pocketing the difference. The signed-out quantity appeared in the record as administered. The patient received partial relief. The discrepancy, if the patient mentioned it, was attributed to individual variation in drug response, a genuine and common phenomenon that provided useful cover. A pharmacist with inventory access could adjust counts in ways that placed the discrepancy in a column labeled wastage rather than theft. Waste documentation required a witness, but the witness requirement was unevenly enforced, and the incentive to provide false witness for a trusted colleague, someone whose behavior had not yet produced visible harm, someone who seemed otherwise competent and conscientious, was sometimes sufficient to ensure that the documentation said what the documentation needed to say. Some of these diversions were detected. They ended careers and sometimes ended in criminal proceedings. The DEA's records of healthcare professionals investigated for controlled substance violations contain names from every year of the period we are discussing. Physicians and nurses and pharmacists who had, in the language of the disciplinary proceedings, violated the conditions of their DEA registration. But detection was not the norm. The norm for a significant proportion of the diversion that occurred from hospital inventories during the 1970s and 1980s and into the 1990s was that the discrepancy was filed in the general account of system, friction, and never examined closely enough to reveal what it actually represented. A milligram here, a vial there. Numbers that didn't quite reconcile, attributed to the ordinary imprecision of a busy ward's record-keeping. The result of all of these channels operating simultaneously, the pharmacy robberies, the forged prescriptions, the doctor shopping, the inside diversion, was a supply of a Dilaudid on the streets of American cities that, by the 1980s, had grown substantial enough to support an organized market with its own pricing, its own reputation economy, and its own vocabulary. The pricing, as we have seen, placed hydromorphone at the top of the diverted opioid hierarchy by value per milligram. This was not arbitrary. The black market, operating without regulators or brand managers or clinical pharmacologists, had arrived at the same conclusion that the pharmacological data supported. This compound was the most potent, the most reliable, and the most experientially compelling opioid available in diverted pharmaceutical form. The market was pricing it accurately. The street value of a drug, it turns out, is one of the more faithful reflections of its pharmacological potency, a grim kind of precision. The names it accumulated were equally descriptive. Dilly's from the brand name, Big D for the same reason and for the obvious suggestion of magnitude, Juice for the injectable liquid form, M80S in reference to the explosive for the quality of the experience it produced, and Hospital Heroin, the name that mattered most, the name that encoded in 2 words everything a potential user in the street economy needed to know. It came from a hospital. It was as powerful as heroin. It was cleaner and more consistent than street heroin because it was pharmaceutical grade and had not been cut with anything. It was, for someone already tolerant to lower potency opioids, an upgrade so significant that the people who had experienced it described it in terms of revelation. The name spread through American cities during the 1970s in the same informal word-of-mouth way that all drug market intelligence spreads, through conversations in specific places among specific people, filtered through the experiences of those who had encountered the compound directly. By the 1980s, it had become sufficiently established in the street vocabulary of cities like Chicago and New York and Philadelphia that a person who knew what they were asking for could ask for it by name and be understood immediately. Here is the irony that the chemists in Ludwigshafen could not have been expected to anticipate in 1923. when they filed their patent for a compound intended to be a safer morphine. The same drug, the same molecule, manufactured in the same facility, by the same process, to the same standards of pharmaceutical purity. One portion of the production went into the locked steel cabinets of hospital narcotics dispensaries, administered in carefully documented doses to patients whose need for pain relief was genuine and whose treatment was supervised by licensed clinicians. Another portion of the same production, the portion that had leaked through the cracks in the system, through the robberies and the forgeries, and the quiet interior diversions, went to the street, where it was bought and sold at a price that accurately reflected its potency, and administered in unsupervised conditions to people whose neurological vulnerability was no different from the hospital patients, but whose access to rescue, if something went wrong, was vastly less reliable. The pharmaceutical company had not built two drugs. It had built one, and the world had found two uses for it. The healthcare system that tracked the first use with triplicate prescriptions and shift change counts and DEA registration numbers did not track the second use at all. It knew in a broad and statistical way that prescription opioids were being diverted. The DEA's enforcement reports documented the phenomenon. The medical literature noted it. Hospital administrators were aware of the general problem in the abstract, in the way that administrators are aware of general problems when those problems have not yet become specific and localized and attached to a name on their staff list. But the specific mechanism, the precise pathway by which a particular vial of Dilaudid moved from a nurse's station to a street transaction, was not systematically tracked. The thefts that were detected were investigated individually, in isolation, without the kind of aggregate analysis that might have revealed patterns. The discrepancies in inventory logs that were not detected by definition, and therefore contributed nothing to the understanding of how large the problem actually was. Nobody was looking at the full picture. And the full picture in the cities of 1980s America was this. The same vial that sat in the nurse's station on the third floor of a hospital on a Tuesday afternoon was, through any of several available mechanisms, capable of appearing on a street corner 3 miles away by Friday evening. The two locations were connected by a pipeline whose existence the system acknowledged in general principle and tracked in specific cases almost not at all. The bodies that would make the absence of tracking impossible to maintain any longer were still coming. They would arrive in emergency rooms and in corner apartments and in bathroom stalls and in the back seats of cars, in the ways that overdose bodies always arrive, without announcement and too late for the intervention that tracking might have enabled. But the worst of what Dilaudid would do to American cities, the period when its name appeared not in pharmacy logs but in coroners' reports, was still, in the early 1980s, accumulating its momentum. It was coming. The emergency room at 2 in the morning has a particular quality of stillness that is deceptive. It looks quiet. The waiting area at that hour holds fewer people than it does in the afternoon. The admissions desk is staffed by a single clerk. The corridor that leads back into the treatment bays is dim in the way that institutional spaces go dim at night. Not dark, never fully dark, but dialed down to a register that acknowledges the hour without surrendering the vigilance that the hour requires. The stillness is deceptive because what it conceals is not peace but readiness. The team behind that quiet corridor is prepared in a way that takes years to build and cannot be switched off. For the moment the quiet breaks, and the quiet always breaks. When the paramedics brought him in, he was not breathing adequately. 32 years old, found in the bathroom of an apartment by a friend who had gone to check on him after he stopped responding to knocks on the door. The friend had known from the quality of the silence on the other side of the door that something was wrong. The friend had called 911 and then had waited in the hallway in the particular posture of someone who knows what they are about to be part of and cannot do anything about it. The attending physician ordered naloxone immediately. Naloxone is an opioid antagonist, a molecule that occupies the Mu-Opioid receptor without activating it, displacing whatever opioid was already there, and reversing, in most cases, within minutes, the respiratory depression that is the mechanism by which opioid overdose kills. It is a remarkable drug in its own right, simple in its action, fast in its effect, and in the context of an opioid overdose, the difference between a patient who is alive in the morning and one who is not. The naloxone was administered. The man's breathing returned. The toxicology, when it came back, confirmed what the clinical picture had already suggested. Hydromorphone. The drug in his system was hydromorphone, Dilaudid, hospital heroin, the compound that the Knoll chemists had synthesized in 1921 as a safer version of the molecule they were trying to improve upon. It was in his system at a concentration that his tolerances, already elevated by months of regular use, had not been high enough to handle. He survived. Not everyone did. Between 1999 and 2017, opioid overdoses killed approximately 400,000 people in the United States. The number is large enough that it resists ordinary comprehension. The mind tends to retreat from figures of that magnitude into a kind of analytical numbness, processing them as statistics rather than as the accumulated weight of individual lives and individual circumstances and individual people who had, at some point before the final point, been someone's child and someone's friend, and someone who had wanted, as everyone wants, to not be in pain. By 2022, the annual death toll from opioid-related causes in the United States had reached 81,806 in a single year, not across a generation, in 12 months. Hydromorphone was not responsible for all of these deaths. The opioid crisis, as it has been documented and analyzed, moved through 3 identifiable waves. The first, in the 1990s and early 2000s, driven primarily by prescription opioids. OxyContin and its relatives, prescribed with an enthusiasm that the clinical evidence did not support, and marketed with an aggressiveness that the regulatory environment in those years did not adequately restrain. The second wave, beginning around 2010, was driven by heroin, as people whose dependency had been established on prescription opioids found that heroin, which had become cheaper and more available as enforcement tightened around the pharmaceutical supply, served the same neurological need at lower cost. The third wave, from 2013 onward, and accelerating through the late 2010s into the present, has been driven by synthetic opioids, primarily illicitly manufactured fentanyl, a compound so potent that a dose measured in micrograms rather than milligrams represents the difference between intoxication and death, and that has proven lethally difficult to dose accurately in street-level transactions. Dilaudid ran through all 3 of these waves, not as the central actor in any of them, but as a persistent thread, present in the prescription opioid market of the first wave as one of the drugs most prized by those who had discovered its black market value, present in the second wave as a bridge compound for users whose tolerance made less potent opioids insufficient, present in the third wave as part of the complex polypharmacy that fentanyl-dominated street markets had produced. Its presence in each wave was shaped by the same properties that had made it medically valuable: the potency, the speed, the reliability of pharmaceutical manufacture. These were features in the hospital. They were hazards on the street. The same molecule, different contexts, and context, it turned out, was the difference between medicine and catastrophe. Not in any simple sense, but in the specific sense of whether there was a clinician in the room, a monitored dose, a reversing agent nearby, and a paper trail that might eventually draw someone's attention to the pattern. Consider the woman who does not appear in any statistic by name. She had her gallbladder removed in the autumn of a year in the early 2000s. The surgery was uncomplicated. The recovery was not especially difficult, as post-surgical recoveries go. But it was her first experience of significant surgery, and therefore her first experience of the particular quality of post-operative pain, the deep internal ache of tissue that has been cut and sutured, and that is in the process of beginning the long work of healing. Her surgeon prescribed Dilaudid for the first week of recovery. The prescription was appropriate. The need was genuine. She took the medication as directed, and she noticed, in the way that the brain always notices, the quality of the experience. Not merely the absence of pain, but the presence of something else, something she did not have adequate language for, and therefore did not discuss with her surgeon when she returned for her 1-week follow-up. The prescription was not renewed. She did not ask for it to be renewed. She returned to her ordinary life, and the ordinary life was adequate, and the medication she had taken was not something she thought about again in any organized way. Until it was. The brain does not forget, not in the way that conscious memory forgets. The mesolimbic reward system, which has recorded the event in the supersized handwriting that extraordinary dopamine surges produce, does not lose its record when the drug clears or when ordinary life resumes. It holds the record in the same patient and indefinite way that the brain holds all learned associations, available, retrievable, activated by contexts that the conscious mind might not recognize as relevant. A period of stress, several months later, the ordinary pain of a difficult year, the particular emotional texture of a night when sleep would not come, and the body felt its own weight as a burden. The record was there, the association was there, the knowledge, not intellectual knowledge, but the body's own remembered knowledge, that there was something that had once made all of this stop. She did not become addicted in the dramatic sense that addiction is sometimes depicted. There was no single catastrophic moment, no sudden plunge from medical use to dependency. There was a gradual process, conducted quietly over a period of time, in which the distance between her and her next dose of something that filled the neurological gap the first prescription had opened became the organizing principle of a significant portion of her daily attention. By the time she understood what had happened, the understanding arrived in the context of a physiological state that made ordinary functioning without the drug extremely difficult. She is not exceptional. She is the norm. The research literature on iatrogenic opioid dependence, dependence that originates in legitimate medical treatment, is not ambiguous. It documents across multiple study populations and multiple clinical contexts that patients prescribed opioids for acute pain develop dependence at rates that the original prescribing decisions rarely account for, not universal rates. not rates that make every person who receives a post-surgical opioid prescription a person who will develop dependence, but rates that are high enough, consistent enough, and well enough documented that the clinical practice of prescribing potent, short-acting opioids for routine post-surgical recovery, without rigorous follow-up and without explicit discussion of dependency risk, was not merely unfortunate in retrospect. It was a foreseeable outcome of a system that chose not to look at what it was producing. And then there was the healthcare professional, the dopamine surge that was 4 to 5 times greater than natural rewards, the mesolimbic pathway that did not ask about employment status, the Mu-Opioid receptor that did not check credentials before it opened its door. These mechanisms operated inside the nervous systems of nurses and physicians and pharmacists in exactly the same way they operated inside everyone else, and the research on substance use disorder in healthcare professionals, a literature that the profession has historically been reluctant to generate, because generating it requires admitting to a problem that professional identity makes difficult to admit. Documents rates that are not lower than those of the general population, and by some measures are higher. The particularity of the healthcare professional's situation was access. The post-surgical patient who developed dependence had to navigate a system, return visits, renewed prescriptions, forged documents, street purchases, that imposed friction on the maintenance of their supply. The nurse in the surgical recovery unit who developed dependence had, in the early hours of a morning shift, a locked cabinet in front of her and a key in her hand, and the gap between her neurological need and the means of meeting it was a gap that could be crossed in 30 seconds. This is not an accusation. It is not an indictment of a profession or of the individuals within it, who were caught in circumstances that the profession had not adequately prepared them to recognize or disclose. It is simply a description of what the structural access, combined with the neuropharmacology, combined with the professional culture that treated vulnerability as incompatible with clinical identity, produced across the decades when Dilaudid's presence in hospital inventories was widespread and the surveillance of those inventories was not. The dopamine surge that had been encoded as extraordinarily significant did not become less significant because the person experiencing it had a stethoscope around their neck. The craving that followed the trough was not negotiable with professional pride. The biological process was not interested in the credentials, and the overdose, when it came, as it came in a number of cases, to people who had begun as caregivers and ended as patients in the units where they had once worked, carried its own specific weight of tragedy, not greater than the tragedy of the street overdose, not lesser, simply different, carrying in it the additional burden of a life built around the capacity to help, now requiring the help it had spent years providing. The naloxone that reversed the emergency room overdose was not enough, in the longer arc of the crisis, to address what was producing the overdoses. It addressed the immediate event. It did not address the system. The healthcare architecture that had simultaneously produced and failed to adequately track the diversion of one of the most potent opioids in its inventory, was not structured for the kind of aggregate, longitudinal analysis that would have revealed the scale of what was happening. Individual incidents were investigated. Individual practitioners were disciplined. Individual pharmacy robberies were prosecuted. But the connection between these individual events, the pattern they formed when viewed together, was not visible to anyone looking only at the individual level, and the institutional incentives to look at the aggregate level were weak. Weak, that is, until the aggregate level made itself impossible to ignore. The emergency rooms began to see the pattern first, because emergency rooms are where the individual incidents of a systemic failure eventually collect. The physicians who treated opioid overdoses in the 1990s and early 2000s were seeing, in the toxicology reports that came back from their patients' blood draws, a pharmacological profile that the prescription records did not always account for. The drug was there. The legitimate prescription was not always there. The gap between the two was not something a single emergency physician could address, but it was something that, multiplied across thousands of emergency rooms and tens of thousands of overdose presentations, produced a signal that the public health infrastructure eventually could not disregard. By the time the signal was loud enough to produce a policy response, new prescription monitoring programs, electronic prescribing requirements that closed the forged prescription gap, better inventory tracking in hospital dispensaries, mandatory cross-referencing of prescription records across pharmacies. The first wave of the crisis had already run for a decade and a half. The response was not too late to be useful. It was too late to be sufficient for the people who had died in the years before it arrived. The limitation of the response, when it came, was a limitation that nobody designing it had intended, but that the pharmacology made almost inevitable. Restricting the supply of diverted prescription opioids did not reduce the neurological need that those opioids had created in the people dependent on them. It reduced the supply. And when the supply contracted, the need found another source. The heroin market, which had been declining through the late 1990s as prescription opioids became more accessible, expanded again as prescription opioids became less accessible. And then the fentanyl market arrived and made everything that had preceded it look, by comparison, like a manageable problem. This is not a story about Dilaudid alone. It is a story about what happens when a neurologically powerful compound enters a system that is not designed to contain it. Not through malice, not through ignorance in any simple sense, but through the accumulated weight of wrong assumptions, inadequate infrastructure, professional culture that made honesty difficult, and regulatory frameworks designed for a world that the drug had already quietly and without announcement left behind. The woman who does not appear in any statistic by name eventually found her way to treatment. She is part of a different statistic now, the one that documents recovery rather than loss. Not everyone was part of that statistic. The mathematics of the crisis are not symmetrical. The losses are larger than the recoveries, by a margin that the annual death tolls express with a bluntness that resists softening. And yet the drug is still prescribed. Every day, in hospitals across America and across the world, because the pain it treats is real, and the alternatives are not always adequate. And this is the impossible position in which the healthcare system has found itself for decades and continues to find itself now, holding a tool that heals and harms with the same molecule, that cannot be set aside without abandoning the people who need it and cannot be deployed without the risk of creating new need in the people it is deployed to help. There is no clean resolution to this position. There is only the ongoing work of trying to navigate it with more care, more honesty, and more structural self-awareness than the previous generation managed. We turn now to that work, and to the question of where Dilaudid, the molecule, the hospital drug, the street legend, the thing with two names and one chemistry, stands today. In a hospital somewhere in the United States tonight, a nurse is walking down a corridor at a pace that looks unhurried but is not. She has a small cart. On the cart Locked is the medication she is about to administer to a patient on the post-surgical ward. A patient who has been awake since 3 in the morning, who has not been able to find a position in the bed that does not aggravate the incision site, who has watched the digital clock on the bedside monitor move through the small hours with the slow cruelty that time displays when you are in pain and waiting for something to change. The nurse will unlock the cart. She will draw the medication, 2 milligrams clear solution, glass syringe, into the barrel and carry it to the IV line and administer it quietly and with the competence that her years of work have made automatic. The pain will stop. The patient will sleep. The nurse will make her documentation entry and move to the next room. The drug she is carrying is the same drug that has occupied the last several hours of this story. The molecule has not changed. The receptor it will find has not changed. The dopamine cascade that will follow has not changed. What has changed? What is different tonight in this hospital from the hospital of the 1970s or the 1980s or the early 2000s is some, though not all, of the infrastructure surrounding the molecule. The locks, in some respects, have been improved. The gaps in the paper trail have been narrowed. The system has learned some of what it did not know, and the learning has been applied with the imperfect and incomplete success that institutional learning always produces. It is worth understanding what has changed, and equally worth understanding what has not. The electronic prescription system is among the most significant of the changes. The paper prescription pad, the stolen pad, the forged pad, the prescription that looked legitimate because nothing in the physical document was verifiably wrong, has been largely replaced in most American states by electronic prescribing systems that generate a digital record at the point of creation, transmit directly to the dispensing pharmacy, and cross-reference against databases maintained at the state level. The physician who writes a prescription for hydromorphone today generates a record that exists independently of the physical document, that cannot be duplicated by anyone who has stolen a pad of paper, and that can be checked against the patient's prescription history in real time by the dispensing pharmacist. This is not a complete solution. The determined fraudster finds workarounds because determined fraudsters always find workarounds, and the electronic system introduced its own vulnerability in the form of electronic script fraud. The generation of fake electronic prescriptions through compromised prescriber credentials or hacked systems, a problem that the DEA was actively combating as recently as 2026. But the electronic system closed the gap that the paper system had left open for decades, the gap through which a stolen prescription pad and a degree of confidence could move significant quantities of Dilaudid from legitimate channels to illegitimate ones. Hospital dispensary tracking has improved in parallel. The electronic medication administration systems that replaced paper narcotics logs in most major hospitals through the 2000s and 2010s created a record of dispensation that was harder to quietly manipulate. Each dose signed out electronically, each administration recorded at the patient's bedside, the inventory count automated and continuous rather than manual and shift-dependent. Waste documentation moved to a 2-person electronic verification process in many institutions. The shift change count became a computer reconciliation rather than a manual recount, and the discrepancies that had previously been attributed to ordinary system friction were flagged automatically rather than absorbed into the general noise. The result was not the elimination of insider diversion. People with authorized access to controlled substances under sufficient neurological pressure will find ways to use that access. The human capacity for navigating institutional controls, when the motivation is sufficiently powerful, is not nullified by electronic systems. What the improved systems did was narrow the margin of undetected diversion, accelerate the detection of discrepancies that would previously have remained invisible for weeks or months, and make the insider diversion that occurred more traceable when it was eventually identified. Naloxone became available without prescription in many American states through the 2000s and 10s, a change that the scale of the fentanyl crisis had made politically achievable in ways that earlier harm reduction arguments had not managed. The reversal agent for opioid overdose, the drug that had saved the man in the emergency room at the beginning of this section, was placed in pharmacies, in community centers, in the hands of first responders and family members, and people who used drugs and knew other people who used drugs. The distribution of naloxone does not prevent overdoses. It converts some fatal overdoses into non-fatal ones, which is not a complete solution, but is meaningfully different from not having the reversal agent available. Prescription monitoring programs, now operating in all 50 American states, built the cross-referencing capacity that the triplicate prescription system had gesturally attempted but never achieved. A patient who attempts to fill a hydromorphone prescription at multiple pharmacies is flagged. A physician whose prescribing patterns fall significantly outside the norms for their specialty is identified. A pharmacy that dispenses controlled substances at a volume inconsistent with its patient population generates an alert. The monitoring programs are not without limitations. They track what is prescribed and dispensed through legitimate channels, but they do not track what is diverted after dispensation. And they are only as useful as the actions taken in response to the flags they generate, which have been inconsistent. These are the improvements, genuine, meaningful, and arrived at far later than they should have been. And then there is the pharmaceutical response, the attempt to solve, through chemistry, the problem that chemistry had created. The ambition was the same ambition that had animated the Knoll Laboratory in 1921, restated a century later with better tools and a more sophisticated understanding of the mechanism. Could you build a formulation of hydromorphone that delivered its clinical benefits without its abuse potential? An extended-release version of hydromorphone, marketed as Paladoni, was approved by the FDA in 2004. The design logic was sound. A slow-release formulation would deliver the drug gradually over an extended period, blunting the rapid onset that created the steep dopamine rise, the experiential quality that made it attractive as a drug of misuse. Without the rush, the reward encoding would be less extreme. Without the extreme reward encoding, the dependency would develop more slowly, if at all. The extended-release version would be, in this analysis, the genuinely safer formulation that the original synthesis had promised but failed to deliver. Paladoni was voluntarily withdrawn from the market in 2005, approximately 11 months after its approval. The reason was a finding that the FDA advisory panel, described with the kind of understatement that scientific literature adopts when the finding is alarming, a high overdose potential when taken with alcohol. The extended release mechanism, when the formulation was exposed to alcohol, consumed with a drink, or dissolved in an alcohol solution by someone attempting to extract the drug for injection, released the entire extended dose simultaneously. A formulation designed to deliver 12 hours of medication gradually delivered it in a single bolus. The protective mechanism became the hazard. The drug that was supposed to be safer, in the presence of a substance as common as alcohol, became more dangerous than the immediate release version it was meant to replace. Paladoni's withdrawal was not the end of the effort. Exalco, a different extended release formulation with a different release mechanism, reached the market in 2010 and has remained available since. The engineering of opioids that are clinically effective without being easily misused continues, with varying degrees of success and with a persistent underlying tension. A drug that is sufficiently aversive to discourage injection or insufflation is also, sometimes, a drug that is harder to use for patients whose clinical need is genuine and whose capacity to tolerate the standard route of administration is limited. The modification that discourages misuse and the modification that preserves therapeutic utility are not always pointing in the same direction. The repeating pattern, a modification intended to produce something better, an outcome that is better in some respects and worse in others, and the molecule unchanged at its center, producing the same neurological event it has always produced when it reaches the receptor that has been waiting for it since before anyone in the Knoll laboratory existed. And then there is the development that closes the circle of this story, in a way that no one in 1926 could possibly have predicted, and that no one who has followed the history of Dilaudid through the decades of this account could contemplate without registering its particular species of irony. In Canada, through the 2020s, a network of healthcare programs operating under the designation of Safer Opioid Supply has been prescribing Hydromorphone, Dilaudid, hospital heroin, the compound with the two names, to people who use street drugs as a harm reduction intervention against the fentanyl crisis. The logic is precise and, once stated, almost obvious. Illicitly manufactured fentanyl has contaminated the street drug supply to a degree that makes virtually every purchase of any street opioid a potentially lethal gamble. The concentration of fentanyl in street drugs is not consistent. It varies from batch to batch, from pill to pill within the same batch, in ways that even an experienced user with a high tolerance cannot reliably anticipate. The result is a market in which people who are physiologically dependent on opioids cannot safely purchase the substance their nervous systems require, because the substance they purchase may contain a quantity of fentanyl sufficient to stop their breathing before they have finished the dose. The Safer Opioid Supply programs offer an alternative: a daily dispensed prescription of pharmaceutical-grade, immediate-release hydromorphone tablets, provided under medical supervision as a substitute for the unpredictable street supply. The drug is exactly what it has always been, manufactured to pharmaceutical standards, consistent in its concentration, precisely what the label says it contains. What has changed is the context of the prescription. The person receiving it is not a post-surgical patient or a cancer patient in palliative care. They are a person whose dependency was established through the street supply, and whose continued use of that supply poses an acute and quantifiable risk of death. The early data from these programs suggested reductions in overdose incidents, in the use of unregulated substances, and in the criminal activities associated with maintaining an illegal drug supply. The drug that the black market had pursued through pharmacy robberies and forged prescriptions was now being prescribed openly and intentionally as a tool against the crisis that the black market had helped create. The drug that the street had renamed hospital heroin was being given back to the street under a prescription. Hold that thought for a moment, not as a political argument in either direction. The safer opioid supply model has genuine critics as well as genuine supporters, and the evidence base is still developing, and this is not the place for a policy assessment. Hold it simply as a fact about what a molecule can become when the context around it changes. The same compound, the same receptor, the same dopamine cascade. In one context, a post-surgical analgesic. In another, a black market prize. In a third, a harm reduction intervention against a drug supply that the molecule itself, in its black market life, had partly helped to create. The molecule does what it has always done in any context in which it finds itself, with any person whose receptor system it encounters. It binds. The lock opens. The cascade begins. The pain, whatever pain, wherever it comes from, of whatever origin, diminishes. This brings us back to the two syringes at the beginning of tonight's story. The woman in the hospital bed in the years after the story begins, and the man in the different kind of room, with the different kind of syringe and the name that wasn't on the label. The same molecule moving toward the same receptor in two entirely different lives, carrying entirely different meanings for the people administering it and the people receiving it, but carrying, inside the brain of each of them, exactly the same chemical event, the same warmth, the same aftermath, the same brain writing the same record in the same oversized letters, regardless of the room it was writing in. The question that this parallel poses has been at the center of every significant debate about opioid pharmacology for the last century, stated in different language in different eras, but always pointing toward the same fundamental difficulty. The chemists who synthesized hydromorphone in Germany in 1921 were trying to answer it. So were the physicians who classified it as Schedule II in 1970. So were the DEA investigators who documented the pharmacy robberies. So were the emergency physicians who administered naloxone and waited for the breathing to return. So were the nurses in the locked cabinet, and the nurses in the safer opioid supply clinics, and the families of people who did not survive their encounter with the molecule, and the families of cancer patients who were able, because of the molecule, to die without the pain that would otherwise have defined their final weeks. The question is this: how do you give someone relief from unbearable pain without giving the relief itself a chance to become unbearable? A century of pharmaceutical ingenuity has not answered it. Regulation has not answered it. Enforcement has not answered it. The neuroscience that mapped the mechanism with such precision has not answered it, because knowing exactly how something works is not the same as knowing how to make it work only in the ways you intend. The answer, if there is one, and there may not be one in any final or permanent sense, lies somewhere in the combination of things: better surveillance, more honest clinical culture, harm reduction infrastructure that meets people where they are rather than where the system wishes them to be, treatment that is accessible before the crisis rather than available only during it, and a willingness to look at the aggregate picture rather than the individual incident, to ask what the pattern is producing rather than only what the individual case requires. It lies, too, in the willingness to hold the full complexity of the molecule without resolving it into something simpler than it is. To say simultaneously, this drug has saved lives, and this drug has cost lives, and these two facts are not in contradiction and cannot be resolved into a single verdict. The locked cabinet is still there in the hospital where the nurse is finishing her round tonight. The card is back at the station, The documentation is entered. The patient is sleeping. The inventory will be counted at shift change, and the count will be compared to the previous count, and the system will do what it can with the information it is given. Outside, the city is doing what cities do at this hour. Most of it is quiet. Some of it is not. The molecule is in both places, as it has been for 100 years, going about its work, answering to two names, producing, in every brain it reaches, the same event. The lock turning, the cascade beginning, the pain receding, without knowledge of which room it is in, or which name it has been given, or what the world has decided, in any given decade, to think about the thing it does. It is simply a structure. 17 carbons, 19 hydrogens, 1 nitrogen, 3 oxygens. A small modification at position 6 of a ring that was first described by a chemist who has been dead for more than a century. And it has been, simultaneously, one of the most trusted tools in modern medicine and one of the most dangerous substances in the modern city, not because it chose to be either of those things, but because the world it entered was not, and perhaps could not have been, entirely prepared for what it was. Good night. Rest well. And if you wake in the night and the room feels too quiet, the history is still here. The molecule is still out there, in the hospitals and in the shadows, doing what it has always done. And the people trying to use it well are still trying. That is, perhaps, the most honest thing that can be said about it. That people are still trying.